This is about me as an individual, not the organization. So I think if the individual knows that their manager is really there to support them because it's about them, creating that kind of mutual respect for each other, I think that's really important. I think it's more challenging when you have a line manager that you have quite a challenging relationship with.
So, welcome to episode 5 of the Tricky to Title podcast. Today I'm joined by Michelle Fox. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Richard.
Very happy. I'm very happy to have you. So, Michelle's got over 25 years' experience in HR. She's had a broad career globally, worked for many very well-known brands, including Tesco, Marks and Spencer's, Johnson Matthey, Elsevier, and National Australia Bank. Her career spans HR systems, org design, diversity and inclusion, talent and performance management, leadership and learning. So very broad, which is fantastic. She holds a master's in HR, master's in executive coaching, and currently, Michelle, you work as an executive coach and consultant.
I do indeed.
Did I get that right?
You
Perfect. So today, Michelle and I will be exploring the topic of career development. So especially focusing in the context of skills, which are very, very topical, but also the technology revolution that we're currently kind of living within, it's occurring within the talent space. As ever, we will have an activity to do as we go along. So if you've seen these before, then sorry about my drawing. But if you haven't seen these before, we have a mug that we'll each be trying to draw in. And then at the end of this, we swap mugs and we each get to keep the other person's mug. So hopefully at the end of this, I will have a lovely wall of everybody's mugs in my office, which will be lovely. We're also joined by Dave the donkey. He comes to every podcast. He is my mascot. He joined me a long time ago in a car that we bought and just was randomly there with a little sticker that said, "Hi, I'm Dave and I'm ready to rave." No idea why I was there. Person sold his car, had no idea why he was there, just appeared. It was very odd. And as ever, I'll just run through the principles of this podcast. So this is not a selling podcast. There's no business names dropped. It is just interesting people talking about interesting things that they're very passionate about, that have some vague relevance, hopefully, to learning, talent, development within the kind of space that we work in. Hope so. We'll see how it goes. So on that topic, then we'll jump straight into career development. And I guess probably the first question, right, that often gets asked is, whose job is it, right? I think employees expect and join companies because they want to be developed. Employers tend to want employees to develop themselves. There's this kind of ongoing clash, I guess, between those two. And from your point of view, Michelle, where's that line? Does the employer still have responsibility for career development, especially given the new world of skills and generative AI and all of the other things that are people's fingers, I guess?
So, great question. I think for me, it is the onus still sits on the employee. They are accountable and responsible for developing their career. The line manager and the employer also play a part in that. So the line manager there is to guide, support, offer advice. Mm-hmm. The employer will no doubt have some kind of learning and development offerings of some description, whether or not that is formal face-to-face learning, whether that's virtual learning, maybe have some specific programs as well. So, for example, future leader programs, a lot of organizations run, but ultimately the accountability sits with the employee to own and grow their careers, and development looks very different to every single person. Sometimes that is around, doing the job that they're doing and they want to stay in that role and do that really well. Other people want to move up into more senior roles in the future. So the onus really sits on the individual to manage their career.
Yeah. There's an interesting point you raised there, I guess, about those people that they want to do the job that they're doing. They want to carry on doing it. They want to do it really well. Yeah. Right. And often they get, I guess, a bit left behind because that's not necessarily seems like, the next step on the ladder or the next opportunity. And I suppose with the role of AI coming in as well, that concept of I love the job that I do and I just want to carry on doing that job. Obviously, those jobs are going to change, and are changing quite quickly. So there's probably a bit of a rethink around career development for those people as well, right? Where perhaps in the past they may have thought, well, it doesn't apply to me because I don't want a career. I just want to come to work, do a good job, and go home. Um, Perhaps they need to rethink about what that means, and I guess there's a role for an employer in that space as well.
There is, employees need to keep relevant. They need to keep up to date with the latest tools, technology, etc. The employer will help them usually with those interventions. But there's other things that people can do. So, for example, reverse mentoring is a great thing, where somebody more junior to them would help them with some of the more technical modern skills that we maybe have today that they don't have. And they can share their experience of the company, or maybe their leadership skills, or other things that that younger person is trying to develop. So reverse mentoring is usually a great way to kind of grow and develop those skills. But the world is changing around us. And people need to look for opportunities around how can they, if they do want to stay doing what they're doing, how do they make sure that they can, use the latest technology? So how are they using AI, for example, in the workplace? And, there's online courses, there's YouTube, there's lots of ways that people can do that. I've got a friend last week who spent an hour with me talking about some really complex prompts in AI because that's what he loves doing. And we just had a coffee and I learned a lot in that 1 hour. So there's lots of different ways you can learn.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean you have to go off and do like a university qualification or, a 6 weeks face-to-face course. You can learn in many different ways. Podcasts are great as well.
Good plug. Well done. Thank you.
That's okay. So I think there's, people need to look at it a bit more broadly than I need to go off somewhere. And ultimately, the higher up you get into the organization, the fewer jobs there are. So not everyone can want to be the next CEO of an organization. Yeah. And actually, people will be at different points of their career as well. So you might have other stuff going on outside of work where actually you just want to come in and do your job because you're trying to manage aging parents, kids at school and everything else. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you don't want to progress your career. It may just not be the right moment for you. And how do organizations continue to support those individuals as long as they're meeting the performance expectations? And I guess that's the thing. Yeah. If you want to, just come in and do your job, how do you continue to maintain what is expected from you from a performance perspective, because the last thing you want to be doing is going down that slope of poor performance as well.
Yeah, and I think what you've alluded to is really interesting, and it kind of leads on to my next question, which is like the role of the line manager in this. And I know you spoke about that at the very beginning, right? And their space in helping to guide individuals within their team. I think we recognise that we've all had very good line managers, hopefully. We've all had line managers that perhaps we look at and think, when I become a line manager, perhaps I won't do that. And often I think that the really good ones are the ones that coach and guide and mentor, extremely well. But it is a difficult skill, and it's also very time consuming. And line managers are very rarely just line managers, right? They've also got their own day job in most cases to do, right? And in most organizations, that day job tends to be the one that they are measured against, right, rather than their performance as a line manager, which naturally would suggest to you as an individual that perhaps you do the one that's going to give you a bonus and a pay rise, and not the one that isn't, maybe. So that was a very long-winded way, I guess, of me asking like the role of a line manager and recognizing where employees are, but also helping it to guide them to the relevant stuff. How important is that? And is that an area that you think organizations are investing as much as they should in?
So from my experience, I've been really lucky to work for 3 fantastic line managers who had really honest and open conversations with me about my career. And their intent was about me. What did I want to do with my career, whether or not that be within that organization or outside of that organization? but it was the relationship I had with them and the space that they created for me to have that really open and honest conversation. So managers play an important part in having and supporting individuals in their teams around their careers and their development. Like I said, guiding, providing feedback as well. I think quite often, particularly developmental feedback, is often shied away from a line manager perspective. And actually, that's a really important piece of information to help that individual grow and develop. Mm-hmm. So managers need to have those kind of tough conversations sometimes, but they are there to really guide them, give them advice, sometimes challenge their thinking as well. I once had a manager say to me, "But have you thought about moving into a direct level role, Michelle?" And to be honest, it was something that I never thought I would be moving into. So I hadn't kind of contemplated it. So then I started asking them questions around, well, do you think I have what it takes to operate at that level? And then what are my gaps? And then I went away and had a bit of a think about it and actually said, I'm not sure that's really where I want to go for my career at this point. Mind you, I was quite early in my career. I still had quite a long way to progress. But I think it's having those really open and honest conversations, but the managers guiding them, but also managers sponsoring individuals as well. So when there are development opportunities that come up and you're talking about them in leadership team meetings and those kinds of things, knowing what your team, how they want to grow and develop and what gaps they've got, to be able to say, well, I've got Jim in my team. Actually, that's an area he's trying to grow in. How about we give him that opportunity to have that as a stretch project or an assignment to help him grow those skills? So they also play that role in kind of advocating for their teams as well. We don't expect managers to have all the answers. And I think that's what sometimes results in managers shying away from career conversations. They feel like they need to know all the answers. And it's not about knowing all the answers. It's about guiding them and supporting them and challenging their thinking sometimes about what they want to do, because sometimes they are thinking quite short term, but how do they think that more longer term? So I think that is really important. Organisationally, you start to get a lot of organisations to invest in line manager capability, because you're right, a lot of individuals progress their careers and then suddenly get given a team and maybe they don't have those skills. I think you're also starting to see some organisations include people measurements in annual goals and objectives, because they're realising that, you know, it's an important part of individuals' roles. And I think sometimes that's been a bit discounted over the years.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's always in organisations I've worked in, it's always been my bugbear. Whether I've been a people manager or not, that, you know, it was never factored in the time it took to be a good people manager, which tended to kind of force me away from doing it somewhat, because it always felt like, you know, I'm doing all this hard work, but everybody else is benefiting from it but me. And you can put up with that for a while, but after a while, that kind of altruistic nature of yours starts to disappear a little bit, and you're starting to think, well, at some point, it would be nice to be recognised for this. So I think it is important that employers do the other side, right, of that coin, because you can give line managers all the support you need, but, you know, as they say, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, right? So fundamentally, so there's a cultural aspect to that. You spoke about, I guess, the line managers not needing to know all of the answers, and I agree with that, but I think certainly perhaps for those at the more junior level, they tend to look at line managers as if they are the font of all knowledge and they do know everything, and they know how the company works and how it's structured and where the opportunities are within the organization, and everything about every role sometimes, which, you know, in larger organizations is impossible to do. And so we spoke in the first episode of this podcast about talent marketplaces, and the role that they have within career development. And I continue to think that a well implemented and culturally implemented talent marketplace is a great opportunity to help career development of individuals, right? Because it gives that kind of insight into all of the roles within the organization, all of the skills that they need, the skills the individual has, and therefore the gaps, and also what skills are closely aligned, right? If you work in learning and development, then you can probably work in marketing, right? You can probably work in internal comms because the skill sets are broadly similar. How do you engage people in a topic? How do you get them to understand? How do you sell to them effectively, right? If you can work in L&D, you can probably work in sales, right? Similar kind of jobs have a similar sort of skill set. There's always going to be gaps, but they're not huge. And I do think telemarketplaces have a space in that. And talking about the gaps then, you've had that good conversation with your line manager. You've had a good discussion in your case, perhaps, for example, about, stepping into that kind of director level role and understanding what those gaps were. There is good scientific research that shows that, depending on your gender, we'll debate about, how much of a gap is required before you don't apply for a role or you don't go for an opportunity. Obviously, that's quite stereotypical in and of itself, right? Because you're broadly brushing all women and all men as the same. Correct. But if we take that as a starting point, right, what is it that employers and line managers can do, I guess, be that formally through learning development opportunities, strict assignments, talent planning, all of that sort of stuff, but also I get more informally through the line manager and seeing those opportunities. What can they do to help overcome that concept? Because that's going to be more and more important as we move through over the next sort of 5-10 years, and tech's growing quickly and skills are changing ever more quickly, roles are changing ever more quickly, right? It's very rare, I think, you're going to have 100% skills match of a job. So how can employers help employees kind of get over that desire, right, to feel almost that comfort blanket of, I know I can already do this job before I do the job?
So my question would be, if you're ticking 100% of the boxes, what are you learning from that experience? There was a LinkedIn survey. It's a little bit old now, but it was talked about that women are 20% less likely to apply for a role than a male, and that actually men need to tick 100% of the box. Men need to tick 60% of the boxes, and women need to tick 100% of the boxes before they will apply. Maybe I'm the odd one out here, but I've never done that. I've always looked at, if I tick about 70% of the boxes for a job, because otherwise, what am I going to learn from the experience? Moving into a different role, I don't want to move into something that I can already do with my eyes shut, because why am I leaving my current job if I can do that? So, for me, it's always about what can I give to that role? And what can I learn from that role that's going to add additional tools to my own personal toolkit? Yeah. And I've had this conversation throughout my career with people, is that if you're ticking all the boxes, you're missing that learning opportunity. So I'm not talking about I tick 1 or 2 boxes on a job ad and I'm going to apply for it and I don't have any of the skills. I'm talking about actually there is a really strong correlation to the skills, but I can also learn something from this. Yep. And that's how I continue to grow and continue to grow and develop my career through the years. It's by taking those opportunities and not being afraid to say, I've got limited experience in these kind of areas of the job, but I've got, loads of experience in these other areas. And that's really what I can bring to this opportunity that we're talking about today.
Yeah. I think that's pretty valid, and it's interesting. I'm going through the kind of recruitment process at the moment as I am looking for roles. You kind of see a mix. There's some employers that will do essential and recommended on job descriptions, which I think is quite helpful because that gives you an idea, right? Okay, I don't have 3-4 of the recommended skills, but I've got all the essential skills, so that's okay. And that gives me that opportunity to learn. But not everyone's doing that. I think it makes it quite hard to then work out. You're kind of almost admitting pre-interview that you're not the ideal candidate in your own head, right? There's this big mental challenge, I think, of imposter syndrome that kind of goes through you. And I have learned to overcome that and just say, sod it, and I'll apply anyway. What's the worst that'll happen? Internally, I think that's even harder to do in a way, because you're kind of opening yourself up to those people that are deciding your bonuses and questions about your future, and saying, do you know what, I can't do this. And that's quite vulnerable to do, and I think it shows a great level of trust in an organization where people feel comfortable to do that, but not everybody does, and not everybody will be in that space. So I guess the role of line manager in that is to gender that kind of safe space for people to feel like that they can have that conversation with that individual, right? It's a human
Yeah.
conversation. It's not a company conversation. But then it comes back to, I guess, the role of employer to make sure that there are things in place to help the employee grow and learn, and not say, no, it's fine, you don't have that skill set. Bring them into the role and then go, what do you mean you don't have that skill set? Uh, why can't you do this thing that we expected you to do straight away? So I guess that's the following question, right? What are the opportunities in your mind for employers when it comes to learning or talent planning, to think about kind of those closing those skill sets and creating that safe space for people? Because I'm not sure that's always followed on, right? The line manager might have a great conversation, might put you in a great place, and you've mentioned sponsorship, which I do think is important. Put you in that space, and then you make a mistake, or you don't know how to do something, and you're worried that you're going to look silly or stupid, or it's all going to fall apart. What's the kind of follow up, I guess, from the employer in that space to keep that safe space going that the line manager has created and not let it fall down?
I think that's a really interesting question, actually, because I think organizations do have that responsibility to create that safe space, particularly, line managers creating that with their teams. How do they create that more broadly? And if I think about myself, one time I put my hand up for a role which I knew I didn't have. Well, I didn't even tick 70%, but I threw my hat in the ring anyway. And do you know what? That led to a really different conversation internally. Okay, I had the first interview. I mean, I didn't get to the second interview stage. But do you know what? It made people realize that I had ambition to do something else. And it actually generated a different conversation with some more senior people within the organization about me and my career. So it definitely didn't backfire from my experience,
Yeah.
but I appreciate that not all organizations are like that. I think this is also where a role of mentoring can come in certain organizations. I've had some really great mentors, particularly when you talk about I don't necessarily have that skill for that, but I need to do a piece of work around that. How can you leverage mentors and your network to help you with that? Now, you've got to be obviously careful about what data you're sharing and those kinds of things. But, I've worked with, a number of different projects where I didn't necessarily have some of the skills, and I've got, particularly around technology, for example. And so I've created like a dummy spreadsheet and then got someone in IT or someone in, that is in analytics to just say, actually, this is where you haven't thought things through properly. This is where, you might need to change something. And then I've just gone back and retrofitted that into the information that I had. So I haven't disclosed anything, but I've used some internal expertise to kind of help me. And likewise with a mentor. I had a mentor for a really long time. She was brilliant. And she let me say, talk to her about different topics. She shared different experiences with me. She shared different pieces of information. She connected me with different people as well, for areas that I wasn't necessarily up to scratch in, let's say.
Yeah.
And that really helped. But I think organizations have, if they really want to develop talent internally, they need to create that space for people to try things, trial and error, being, things that not going to plan, not being career limiting, and actually seeing that as a development opportunity for people. Mm. And also looking to create those moments for people to actually try different things, whether or not that be, as we kind of talked about before, that projects, kind of stretch projects, whether or not that's secondments, whether or not that's some job shadowing. Employers need to create those opportunities for people as well,
Yep.
Which I appreciate can be challenging at sometimes, and particularly in large organisations. But, we're starting to see kind of internal project skill lists as well. I've seen in organisations where you could put a project that you had and that, you needed somebody for 10% of the time to help with X, and it would help them to develop more broader skills as well. So there are kind of some really nifty ways and very simple ways organizations can do to help people with that.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't all need to be super planned in. I guess, there's this sort of senior level talent planning, talent
Mhm.
development programs, which are very well thought out, very curated, thoughtfully built, and covered to effectively create that culture of, you're key to us and we want to see you flourish.
Mhm.
You can't do that for everybody. So then there are those smaller opportunities, and creating, projects and gigs, and basing your development around skills is some great areas for that. I think your point about your Excel spreadsheet, where you weren't quite sure what to do, and you had your internal network to support you, right? I think that's a really great example of peer learning and peer support. And I guess that will only evolve with the advent of AI, right? Because in the future you can just prompt it and give it an Excel spreadsheet and it'll effectively do. It depends how much you trust your AI. We won't get into some
No,
of
let's
some of
not
its
get
more
into that.
hallucination stuff. So for me, I'm still on the networking side, but I think it will become a mix of both of those things, right? Because people still will need the human conversation, the human touch. That's not going to disappear. I think AI will become a more functional approach to learning, but we'll see.
And I also think about your external network as well. Like you said in the intro, I've worked for a number of different companies.
Mm.
I've still got friends in those companies, and quite often we'll like message each other and say, I need to do X, Y, and Z. Kind of, what are you doing in your company? What else have you seen that might help me? So I think networking is really critical.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people don't like networking, but I think find the way of networking that you enjoy. So, for example, I don't particularly like going to big, large networking and walking in a room where I don't know anyone and having to make small talk with people.
It's the worst thing in the world.
But actually, networking with my peer group over a coffee, one on one, and hearing kind of what they're up to, what are they doing now, what's kind of new in their business. I actually really enjoy it because I get to catch up with people that maybe I haven't seen for a few years, and how the kids, how was, what holidays you've been on, kind of get all that small, up to date on life events as well
Yeah.
as kind of what's going on at work, and, what are they kind of saying, or saying to them, I'm thinking of doing A within my organization. Like, you've done something similar. Like, what are the downfalls? What do I need to think about? What haven't I seen that I need to see in order to be able to mitigate that risk within the organization that I'm currently working in? And so I think those networks are really, really important. And don't be afraid to ask. I mean, I know so many people that don't want to ask their friends for help, but your friends will always want to help you because they want you to succeed.
Yeah.
And I know myself this year, I've reached out to a load of people that I used to work with, and they've all been very gracious with their time, helping me, connecting me, talking, helping me talk to other people, other organizations. So, don't be afraid to reach out. I know I love it when people reach out to me and ask me, for advice, questions, help. I'm always happy to give it. So I think most people are.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. I think, yeah, it's rare I've experienced having a needing support from someone and not receiving it. And I think that, what goes around comes around is a good saying for that, right? You tend to give it back. So, right. I think we do a quick mug check, and I'm actually quite disappointed about this one. I'm sorry, Michelle. So I had my 3 T's and then I forgot what I was drawing halfway through. So it's not so much tea anymore. But worse than that, unfortunately, Dave appears to become a brown pig. And
Dave has become a brown pig.
And I'm not. I drew the ear and I was quite happy with the ear, and then I started on the mouth and that wasn't too bad, and then then he just became a pig, and I don't know how that happened. So sorry, Dave.
And mine is, well, the topic of conversation today.
Excellent.
And I'm still working on what's going around that.
I can't see it. I'm very excited.
Trying to find some artistic talent within me today.
Yeah, I've been trying now for this is the 5th one, and I'm not. It still eludes me, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. Okay, so let's talk about squiggly careers. A concept I think that's been around for very long time. I would say talked about a lot in learning circles. I'm not sure it's spoken about outside of kind of talent spaces, talent learning spaces. Really, I'm not sure most employees are talking about squiggly careers, perhaps senior staff are, but outside of that, I'm not sure it's really become part of the norm yet. I guess with growth of skills, the technology revolution that we're going through, do you see now there is more likely to be the end of kind of the career ladder, that upwards only is the only way to go, and an increase in that kind of non-linear portfolio style kind of career that I guess some industries have been doing for some time, realistically?
I think the career ladder disappeared quite a while ago now, if I'm really honest. I think there are a small number of professions where that probably still exists, but I think to a large degree, that's I think people have realised that breadth of experience and having sideways moves are really, really important in getting that, like I said, that kind of more rounded experience, trying different things. I know that, I've worked with a number of senior leaders throughout my career, and quite often when we start talking about particularly general management type of roles in an organisation, it's not just about one discipline. They have to be able to contribute to a complete discussion. So around financials, HR, marketing, everything. So having that kind of breadth of experience, particularly earlier in your career, I think is really beneficial. So I think that ladder is kind of gone. I think it's personally, I think it's good that it's gone because everyone has a different route to get to their careers. I know that I've run sessions before with, for example, finance leaders, and I've gotten them to speak about their careers, and everyone's taken a slightly different route to get there. I would say there's not one route necessarily to a job. If I think about what I'm doing now, I remember years ago somebody said to me, if you want to work in talent and leadership, you have to have done recruitment. And I still think to this day, I've never worked in recruitment, but I still think to this day that was so short-sighted because actually I had a passion for a lot of other things around the talent, leadership, learning space. And actually that was probably more important, that passion, rather than of being able to screen CVs and call people and talk to them on a phone.
Yeah.
Sorry, my recruitment friends. I know you do a lot more than that, but
that's me never getting a job. Excellent.
But I think, so I think it is about that breadth of experience. I think people also are changing careers as well.
Yep.
I've worked with helped a lot of individuals to really think about, well, what are your transferable skills and actually where else could they be used? I think you're seeing a lot of burnout in organisations as well. I mean, I think if you look at the NHS as an example, that's obviously the health system here in the UK for anyone that's not in the UK. Doctors are burning out at a really high rate and then having to do career pivots. And so I'm thinking you're starting to see a lot more of that going on. I think also, for years, people have been funneled into university qualifications. Mm-hmm. And you're 18, you might not really know what you want to do with the next 30, 40 years of your life. And I think quite often people kind of get into the real world of work after doing qualifications and realise this isn't really what I want to be doing. So I think you can have multiple careers. And I think you're starting to see, as you said, that portfolio style of career coming as well, where people are working for multiple companies. So you're not just employed by one company, you're doing work for multiple different organizations, or you're doing assignments and then another assignment and another assignment and getting that breadth of experience from different organizations. And I think you'll continue to see that. I think we started seeing it during the pandemic, people starting to do a lot more side hustles, or maybe that existed before and it just was less evident. I think it came out a lot more during the pandemic. And I think people want to continue with that, part-time working. I do think organizations need to think a little bit more about part-time working and how can you give people the choice of doing a corporate kind of, 2 or 3 days a week and doing a side hustle as well. Mm-hmm. I think we need to get a bit smarter from an organizational perspective to allow that, because it's great for both the employer and the individual.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think this is kind of just the way that world is going to keep working. And I think remote working, I know a lot of organizations are starting to mandate 3 or 4 days a week back in the office. I personally think that's quite short-sighted. I think it needs to be about individuals. I realize we want to be fair across the organization, and I get that. And I get we need to have time together in teams, but I think there needs to be the right balance. I'm not sure mandating 4 days a week in the office is the right thing longer term. And I think you ultimately end up losing talent. You'll get some people that want to be in an office, and I've met people that are like, even during the pandemic, wanted to be in an office.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, people wanting to manage their work and life, and flexible working provides that. I mean, I was really lucky, even when I was working in Australia 15 or so years ago, I had flexible working then. It wasn't a new thing for me working from home. And I think I've been lucky that I've always had an employer that has enabled me to do kind of an office home split. But I think that's important. I think that we need to continue to make sure that people can live the lives that they want to be living, work, home, caring, and everything else that they've got to manage as well.
Yeah, I agree. Certainly on the remote working piece, Nick Shackleton Jones did a very good, I think it was on TikTok. It's made its way to LinkedIn, I'm sure, but a very good little video explaining his thoughts about remote working, which made me laugh, but also I think there's an awful lot of truth in it. And I'll link to it in the description of this podcast. But it is, and it comes back, I guess, then moving on to that conversation, which is a very broad topic and probably not one for right now, but the concept of measuring output rather than measuring presenteeism or all of that sort of stuff, and actually what are your realistic expectations of the role and the individual, and actually if they get all the work done, does it matter if they get it done in 15 hours or they get it done in 30 hours? The work's done, right? And that's what you're paying them for, not necessarily the number of hours. And there's some big cultural stuff in there which I think falls back into that remote working piece, right? If we're able to truly move to a culture of measuring output, and you can do that well and robustly and fairly, remote working, why would you not do that, right? If an employee needs to collaborate in order to get the output, then they'll collaborate and they'll do that in the best way that works for them and others in the team. So yeah, it's a topic that we could probably talk about for a while.
Well, I think as well, I've worked for a lot of global organizations. Half the time the people I'm working with aren't even based in the country where I'm living.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a topic for another day, but yeah, I definitely think it's
collaboration feels like a handy excuse for me these days rather than a real need, because I think back to pre-pandemic and I think about the way that offices were designed, and they were not designed for collaboration. So why suddenly have we decided that you can only possibly do that in the office when we weren't bothered about it before? It all seems a little bit odd to me, but anyway. Okay, so we'll move on to last kind of two areas, really, I guess. The first is some practical tips and practical career development conversations. So we've spoken a lot about what a good career development conversation looks like by a line manager, and the role of the kind of coaching and the mentoring, the role of having a sponsor within an organization. But practically, a line manager might get, if they're a good line manager, say they're a good line manager, an hour once every 2 weeks, maybe, with the employee to cover everything, not just their career, but also all of the work and, all the things that are going wrong and what they need them to do next week, and et cetera, et cetera. So what does a good career development conversation look like? What are the kind of tools, the rituals that a line manager and the employee needs to put in place? I know when I ran my last team before I left my last employer, I was very much focused on this is their one-to-one, not mine. They need to drive the agenda. They need to tell me what they want to talk about and what it looks like, and they need to come prepared for it, because this isn't my job right? My job is the coaching, the mentoring, the support, the guiding. So what kind of rituals, I think, from your perspective, does a line manager specifically, I guess, in the first instance, need to put in place to make sure those conversations are worthwhile?
I think there needs to be I think there needs to be that open and transparency around the conversation in order to have a really great career conversation. And that takes both parties. There has to be that trust, and trust takes time to build. But it's about the manager's intent as well. You know, as I said, I had really three brilliant career conversations throughout or line managers in my career, and their intent was about me. This is about me as an individual, not the organization. Um, so I think if the individual knows that their manager is really there to support them because it's about them, I think, and creating that kind of mutual respect for each other, I think that's really important. I think it's more challenging when you have a line manager that you have quite a challenging relationship with. And if that's the case, then, you know, you don't only have to have career conversations with a manager. You can use other managers within the organization if you feel more comfortable with somebody else.
Yeah.
But I think it's creating that space to have that really open and honest conversation. I think it's also around, you are right, managers have a very finite period of time. You might have a fortnightly one-to-one. You may end up having monthly one-to-ones if that's the case. And it doesn't need to be a whole hour conversation about your career and development. It can be, you can have those 1 hour conversations. Yes, of course. But actually, you're better to have that regular ongoing dialogue around your career and your development. So you could use, for example, a one-to-one where the individual is coming to that conversation prepared to say, actually, I want to talk about these few things that are kind of on the go at the moment, these projects, these pieces of work. These are a couple of challenges I've got. And I also want to spend 15 minutes talking about my career and my development. But that's up to, as you rightly said, that's up to the individual. They need to come prepared to that. It shouldn't be just a 1 hour conversation of a manager going, and what about this? 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 And I've had those conversations as an employee where a manager's gone, I need update on these 15 pieces of work. Let's go through it. There needs to be other ways. If that's what you're using one-to-ones for, I don't think you're necessarily getting the best value out of that time. Maybe look for other mechanisms to kind of get those regular kind of work updates, as I would call them.
Yep.
But use that time to really help and support that individual. If they're struggling with something, use it as a coaching moment. But I think a lot of people think that, you know, career and development conversations are this big event that need to happen. Actually, it's those regular ongoing conversations throughout the year that actually really make the difference. And it's not that once a year, let's have that conversation. Great, we've ticked that box. Let's not talk about anything ever again until the next year. And I'm told by somebody that I have to do that conversation.
Yeah.
That's not how it should be.
Yeah.
It should be this, you know, I want to have this conversation with you. I want to keep this ongoing dialogue. But you also, as a manager, need to be respectful for that employee. Because as we said, some employees just really want to keep doing what they're doing. So actually, they might not want to have a regular conversation about their career and their development. So you also need to respect that. So I would agree the employee should kind of lead that directionally on where they want to go.
Yeah. And I guess last question then is probably the future of career developments. And, you know, we've alluded to tech through this. We've spoken about AI at points. We've spoken about the role of talent marketplaces and how they can help kind of employees understand the structure, I guess, of an organization and the roles and the skills and what those gaps are. One thing you mentioned I thought was really interesting, and AI does have, I think, the potential to support, is that if you are in a position where you don't have that level of trust, that level of engagement with your line manager, and actually those conversations are very difficult, or line manager just isn't naturally very good at coaching, mentoring, or just isn't interested in that part of their role, right? Which will infect you and your career, and often means that you as an employee ends up looking for a role elsewhere, right? Because of that poor line management. I guess AI, for me, to your point about, It doesn't have to be your line manager.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good safe space. I think it probably needs to understand your organizational context, and that's where there is a need for employers to invest in AI within their organization that will
Mm-hmm.
enable this sort of, this sort of conversation. And I don't think it should ever be done with the aim of replacing
No.
the conversation, which is, I guess, the fear, right? There's that fine balance where you don't want to entirely replace the conversation. You want to aid it. But there are some places where that conversation isn't happening. And so that as a backstop is not necessarily a bad one. I guess my last question for you, Michelle, is from your point of view, what do organizations risk if they're not prioritizing career development?
They risk losing their people. You know, I think they risk not having their people and the skills that they need for the future. And, they're going to get, I think, when you start losing a lot of people over a period of time, I think, you then think about, well, what's the reputational risk as well? It may not be on an internet site somewhere that says, X is a bad employer, but word of mouth gets out there, let's be honest. And people know which organizations they wouldn't go near because they've got such a bad reputation. So I think organizations need to be really mindful of that. We are becoming, everything is online these days. So you do have the Glassdoors of the world that, employees freely rate how they feel about their organization. I think you see it a lot in internal employee surveys as well. Careers always comes up. I mean, I've been working in this space, you said 25 years. Careers always comes up on these surveys. So I think there's also an element of employers can't give everything. I think gone are the days of tapping people on the shoulder and just moving them, which I think is great. I think having that more open and transparent way. But it's a big risk to the organisation if they're not actively managing and developing their people. Also, how are you helping them when we do organisational structure changes? And you spoke about, I've done quite a few in my career as well. But how are you setting those people up for post that change as well?
Yeah.
And if you're not investing them in the skills when they're internally, it makes that transition, if you do need to let them go, so much harder for that individual because they're so far behind the curve.
Yeah.
So I think there is a responsibility to help people get those skills. But I do fundamentally believe the onus still sits on the employee to be building up their skills over time. But talent, there was a saying, talent is scarce. I think we're starting to see at the moment that there's been a lot of organisational change, particularly here in the UK. I would say over the last 12 to 18 months, a lot of organisations are doing restructures. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a lot more people out on the market at the moment looking for jobs, but the tide will change. And it will again become quite scarce talent. So how do you really keep and develop? And you've got to think about the amount of investment they're making in these individuals. I've worked for organisations that have sent their people on, very expensive training and development opportunities. You don't want to then turn around and lose that investment that you've made in those individuals as well. So how do you keep your employee population within the organisation? And let's be honest, there'll be individuals that, maybe it's not how the organisation is shifting and evolving. Maybe it's not the right place for them anymore.
Yep.
But that then goes back to having those really tough conversations that, line managers need to have with their people. But do that in a supportive manner.
Perfect. Okay. Well, talking about supportive manners and difficult conversations, you should move on to my mug, Michelle. So Dave still looks like a pig, but this time he's now saying oink, but also with a question mark because he's very confused about what it is. And I've coloured in my 3 T's just to try and make them less rubbish. And I've also written tricky to title underneath. Just in case you couldn't work out what I was trying to say. So that you'll be glad to know you get to take this home.
Excellent.
Aren't you lucky?
I look forward to having my coffee in that tomorrow morning.
You can take it home with a piece of wood that you've bought with you.
Procured.
Anyone can ask. That's fine. Any comments? You can ask why Michelle turned up today with a piece of wood. It's fine.
And you have one that says careers and some flowers.
Beautiful.
Because your career should bloom.
Oh, well done. That was perfect. Okay, and on that, I think we'll wrap up this episode of the Tricky to Title podcast. A massive thank you, Michelle, for coming along, sharing your insights, sharing your journeys. Thank you, everybody that was watching. Thank you for everybody that was listening. If something sparked your curiosity, given you an idea, made you think about how you learn, I'd love to hear about it. You can find Michelle and I both on LinkedIn, or you can email me at tricky2title@gmail.com. And then finally, I'm going to continue to blame ChatGPT for this line for the rest of my life, because it's very cheesy and I didn't write it. But the ending is, I'm Richard Pedley. Stay curious, stay messy, and don't worry about the title.